We're live.
Yeah.
You're live.
Good evening. Hi, Peggy.
Good Monday.
Hope you're doing well.
Yeah.
Happy to see your name up there each week.
Mm-hmm.
We're happy for anyone who's joined us, actually.
Have to try and figure out another book.
Yeah.
We'll just keep doing this through all COVID.
Let us know if you have any ideas.
Think maybe of a kid's book too.
Yeah.
I'll probably do that also
Mm-hmm.
in addition to that. So I'll
Something
reach out.
lighter hearted maybe.
Yeah. Lighter hearted, but in the as serious and tragic as this is,
Mm-hmm.
it's such a parallel of Jesus's story for us. It's like the love really mixed into tragedy.
Yeah.
Like I think maybe it wouldn't be real if it.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to forget that or to think that those fairy tales weren't real? Like I guess the Santa Claus age, right? Like when you had that kind of thing, like, a loss of innocence, but also a realization like that it wasn't real, right?
Yeah.
Like,
and there's a sweetness we discover, I think, in hard things that is much richer a lot of times.
Like, actually Santa Claus was actually your parents. Oh, wait.
Wow, they don't know who's watching.
Oh, we don't. Oh, sorry.
Parents.
They're not going to be reading these chapters with their kids.
Sorry. True.
Sorry. Leave it to me. Foot, pink, right in the mouth. Anyway, maybe you better just start reading.
Yeah, I'll dive in. We're reading 13.
We start chapter 13 tonight at Ravensbrook.
Yes. For 2 more incredible days and 2 more nights, we were carried deeper and deeper into the land of our fears. Occasionally, one of the loaves of bread was passed from hand to hand, but not even the most elementary provision had been made for sanitation, and the air in the car was such that few could eat. And gradually, more terrible than the crush of bodies and the filth, the single obsession was something to drink. 2 or 3 times when the train stopped, the door was slid open a few inches and a pail of water passed in. But we had become animals, incapable of plan or system. Those near the door got it all. At last, the morning of the 4th day, the train stopped again and the door was open its full width. Like infants on hands and knees, we crawled to the opening and lowered ourselves over the side. In front of us was a smiling blue lake. On the far side, among the sycamore trees, rose a white church steeple. The stronger prisoners hauled buckets of water from the lake. We drank through cracked and swollen lips. The train was shorter. The cars carrying the men had disappeared. Only a handful of soldiers, some of them looking no older than 15, were there to guard 1,000 women. No more were needed. We could scarcely walk, let alone resist. After a while, they got us into the straggly columns and marched us off. For a mile, the road followed the shore of the lake, then left it to climb a hill. I wondered if Betsy could make it to the top, but the sight of trees and sky seemed to have revived her, and she supported me as much as I her. We passed a number of local people on foot and in horse-drawn wagons. The children especially seemed wonderful to me, pink-cheeked and healthy. They returned my stares with wide-eyed interest. I noticed, however, that the adults did not look at us, but turned their heads away as we approached. It's just as hard as the complicity that is talked about so much around the Holocaust of folks who didn't do the terrible things we read about, but were present and seeing it happen and therefore complicit in the crimes. Even pointing, I don't want to skip over the fact that the 15-year-old soldiers, like the Germans were utilizing 15-year-old members who had been in the Hitler Youth originally because they were so depleted. Their forces were so depleted.
You think like now we would we would not consider age 15 to be an age of consent.
Right. Yeah.
And they were indoctrinating these boys, and why do you say that? Because they don't have a thought to say yes or no.
Yeah.
Totally exploiting all the way down.
Yeah. And just the way she calls them animals, they become like animals.
That they had.
And infants, just that they're reduced to, they really were, that was the intention, really, was to make them less than they were, less human, less grown. From the crest of the hill, we saw it, like a vast scar on the green German landscape, a city of low gray barracks surrounded by concrete walls on which guard towers rose at intervals. In the very center, a square smokestack emitted a thin gray vapor into the blue sky. Ravensbrück. Like a whispered curse, the word passed back through the lines. This was the notorious women's extermination camp, whose name we had heard even in Harlem. That squat concrete building, that smoke disappearing in the bright sunlight. No, I would not look at it. As Betsy and I stumbled down the hill, I felt the Bible bumping between my shoulder blades. God's good news. Was it to this world that he had spoken it? Now we were close enough to see the skull and crossbones posted at intervals on the walls to warn of electrified wiring along the top. The massive iron gates swung in. We marched between them. Acres of soot-gray barracks stretched ahead of us. Just inside the wall, it was a row of waist-high water spigots. We charged them, thrusting hands, arms, legs, even heads under the streams of water, washing away the stench of the boxcars. A squad of women guards in dark blue uniforms rushed at us, hauling and shouting, swinging their short, hard crops. At last they drove us back from the faucets and herded us down an avenue between barracks. This camp appeared far grimmer than the one we had left. At least in marches about Voot, we had caught sight of fields and woods. Here, every vista ended in the same concrete barrier. The camp was set down in a vast man-made valley, rising on every side to those towering white-topped walls. At last we halted. In front of us, a vast canvas tent roof, no sides, covered an acre or more of straw-strewn ground. Betsy and I found a spot on the edge of this area and sank gratefully down. Instantly, we were on our feet again. Lice. The straw was literally alive with them. We stood for a while, clutching blankets and pillowcases well away from the infested ground. But at last, we spread our blankets over the squirming straw and sat on them. Some of the prisoners had brought scissors from Voot. Everywhere beneath the huge tent, women were cutting one another's hair. A pair was passed to us. Of course, we must do the same. Long hair was folly in such a place. But as I cut Betsy's chestnut waves, I cried. Toward evening, there was a commotion at one end of the tent. A line of SS guards was moving across it, driving women out from under the canvas. We scrambled to our feet and snatched up our blankets as they bore down upon us. Perhaps 100 yards beyond the tent, the chase stopped. We stood about, uncertain what to do. Whether a new group of prisoners had arrived or what the reason was for driving us from the tent, no one knew. Women began spreading their blankets on the hard cinder ground. Slowly it dawned on Betsy and me that we were to spend the night here where we stood. We laid my blanket on the ground, stretched out side by side, and pulled hers over us. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Betsy's sweet soprano was picked up by voices all around us. Lead thou me on. Do you know that song?
Couldn't say that it is. It must be old hymn.
It's too bad I didn't know the tune. I could have sang it for everybody. That's a joke.
You'll pick it up next time.
Yeah. We were waked up sometime in the middle of the night by a clap of thunder and a deluge of rain. The blankets soaked through and water gathered in puddles beneath us. In the morning, the field was a vast, sodden swamp. Hands, clothes, and faces were black from the cinder mud. We were still wringing water from our blankets when the command came to line up for coffee. It was not coffee, but a thin liquid of approximately the same color, and we were grateful to get it as we shuffled double file past the makeshift field kitchen. There was a slice of black bread for each prisoner, too, and nothing more until we were given a ladle of turnip soup and a small boiled potato late in the afternoon. In between, we were kept standing at rigid attention on the soggy parade ground where we had spent the night. We were near one edge of the huge camp here, close enough to the outer wall to see the triple row of electric wires running along the top. 2 entire days we spent this way, stretching out again the second night right where we stood. It had not rained again, but ground and blankets were still damp. Betsy began to cough. I took Nolly's blue sweater from my pillowcase, wrapped it around her, and gave her a few drops of the vitamin oil. But by morning, she had agonizing intestinal cramps. Again and again throughout that second day, when she had to ask the impatient women monitor at the head of our row for permission to go to the ditch that served as sanitary facility. It was the third night, as we were getting ready to lie down again under the sky, when the order came to report to the processing center for new arrivals. A 10-minute march brought us to the building. We inched along a corridor into a huge reception room, and there under the harsh ceiling lights we saw a dismal sight. As each woman reached a desk where some officer sat, she had to lay her blanket, pillowcase, and whatever else she carried onto a growing pile of these things. A few desks farther on, and she had to strip off every scrap of clothes, throw them onto a second pile, and walk naked past the scrutiny of a dozen SS men into the shower room. Coming out of the shower, she wore only a thin prison dress and a pair of shoes. Nothing more. But Betsy needed that sweater. She needed the vitamins. Most of all, we needed our Bible. How could we live in this place without it? But how could I ever take it past so many watchful eyes without the overalls covering it? We were almost at the first desk. I fished desperately in my pillowcase, drew out the bottle of vitamins, and closed my fist around them. Reluctantly, we dropped the other things on the heap that was fast becoming a mountain. Dear God, I prayed, you have given us this precious book. You have kept it hidden through checkpoints and inspections. You have used it for so many. I felt Betsy stagger against me and looked at her in alarm. Her face was white, her lips pressed tight together. A guard was passing by. I begged him in German to show us the toilets. Without so much as a glance, he jerked his head in the direction of the shower room. Timidly, Betsy and I stepped out of line and walked to the door of the big, dank-smelling room with its row on row of overhead spigots. It was empty, waiting for the next batch of 50 naked and shivering women to be admitted. Please, I said to the SS man guarding the door, where are the toilets? He did not look at me either. Use the drain holes, he snapped, and as we stepped inside, he slammed the door behind us. We stood alone in the room, where a few minutes later we would return stripped even of the clothes on our backs. Here were the prison things we were to put on, piled just inside the door. From the front and back of each otherwise ordinary dress, a large X had been cut out and replaced with cloth of another color. And then we saw something else, stacked in the far corner, a pile of old wooden benches. They were slimy with mildew, crawling with cockroaches, but to me they seemed the furniture of heaven itself. The sweater! Take the sweater off, I hissed, fumbling with the string at my neck. Betsy handed it to me, and in an instant I had wrapped it around the Bible and the vitamin bottle and stuffed the precious bundle behind the benches. And so it was that when we were herded into that room 10 minutes later, we were not poor, but rich. Rich in this new evidence of the care of him who was God, even of Ravensbrook.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, right.
Pretty amazing.
You want to continue?
Sure. We stood beneath the spigots as long as the flow of icy water lasted, feeling it soften our lice-eaten skin. And then we clustered, dripping wet, around the heap of prison dresses, holding them up, passing them about, looking for approximate fits. I found a loose, long-sleeved dress for Betsy that would cover the blue sweater when she would have a chance to put it on. I squirmed into another dress for myself, then reached behind the benches and shoved the little bundle quickly inside the neck. It made a bulge you could have seen across the groat marked. I flattened it out as best I could, pushing it down, tugging the sweater around my waist, but there was no real concealing it beneath the thin cotton dress. And all the while, I had the incredible feeling that it didn't matter, that this was not my business, but God's, that all I had to do was walk straight ahead. As we trooped back out through the shower room door, the SS men ran their hands over every prisoner, front, back, and sides. The women ahead of me was searched 3 times. Behind me, Betsy was searched. No hand touched me. At the exit door to the building was a second ordeal, a line of women guards examining each prisoner again. I slowed down as I reached them, but the Aufseherin in charge shoved me roughly by the shoulder. Move along, you're holding up the line. And so Betsy and I arrived in Barracks 8 in the small hours of that morning, bringing not only the Bible, but a new knowledge of the power of him whose story it was. There were 3 women already asleep in the bed assigned to us. They made room for us as best they could, but the mattress sloped, and I kept sliding to the floor. At last, all 5 of us lay sideways across the bed and managed to get shoulders and elbows arranged. The blanket was a poor, threadbare affair compared with the ones we had given up, but at least the overcrowding produced its own warmth. Betsy on the blue sweater beneath her long-sleeved dress, and wedged now between me and the others, her shivering gradually subsided. And she was asleep. I lay awake a while longer, watching a searchlight sweep the rear wall in long, regular arcs, hearing the distant calls of soldiers patrolling the walls. Morning call at Ravensbrück came half an hour earlier than at Voot. By 4:30 a.m., we had to be standing outside in the black pre-dawn chill, standing at parade attention in blocks of 100 women, 10 wide, 10 deep. Sometimes after hours of this, we would gain the shelter of the barracks, only to hear the whistle. Everybody out! Fall in for roll call. Barracks 8 was in the quarantine compound. Next to us, perhaps as a deliberate warning to newcomers, were located the punishment barracks. From there, all day long, and often into the night, came the sounds of hell itself. They were not the sounds of anger or of any human emotion, but a cruelty altogether detached. Blows landing in regular rhythm, screams keeping pace. We would stand in our 10 deep ranks with our hands trembling at our sides, longing to jam them against our ears to make the sound stop. The instant of dismissal, we would mob the door of Barracks 8, stepping onto each other's heels in our eagerness to get inside, to shrink the world back to understandable proportions. It grew harder and harder. Even within these 4 walls, there was too much misery, too much seemingly pointless suffering. Every day, something else failed to make sense. Something else grew too heavy. Will you carry this too, Lord Jesus? But as the rest of the world grew stranger, one thing became increasingly clear, and that was the reason the 2 of us were here. Why others should suffer, we were not shown. As for us, from morning until lights out, whenever we were not in ranks for roll call, our Bible was the center of an ever-widening circle of help and hope. Like waifs clustered around a blazing fire, we gathered about it, holding out our hearts to its warmth and light. The blacker the night around us grew, the brighter and truer and more beautiful burned the word of God. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Nay. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. I would look about us as Betsy read, watching the light leap from face to face. More than conquerors. It was not a wish. It was a fact. We knew it. We had experienced it minute by minute, poor, hated, and hungry. We are more than conquerors. Not we shall be, we are. Life in Ravensbrück took place on 2 separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable, external life, grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better, Truth upon truth, glory upon glory. They got you're reading Paul.
Yeah.
To live is Christ, to die is
Yeah.
gain. Sometimes I would slip the Bible from its little sack with hands that shook. So mysterious it had become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marveled sometimes that the ink was dry. I had believed the Bible always, but reading it now had nothing to do with belief. It was simply a description of the way things were, of hell and heaven, of how men act and how God acts. I had read 1,000 times the story of Jesus' arrest, how soldiers had slapped him, laughed at him, flogged him. Now such happenings had faces and voices. Fridays, the recurrent humiliation of medical inspection. The hospital corridor in which we waited was unheated, and a fall chill had settled into the walls. Still, we were forbidden even to wrap ourselves in our own arms, but had to maintain our erect, hands at sides position as we filed slowly past a phalanx of grinning guards. How there could have been any pleasure in the sight of these stick-thin legs and hunger-bloated stomachs, I could not imagine. Surely there is no more wretched sight than the human body unloved and uncared for. Nor could I see the necessity for the complete undressing. When we finally reached the examining room, a doctor looked down each throat, another, a dentist presumably, at our teeth, a third in between each finger, and that was all. We trooped again down the long, cold corridor and picked up our X-marked dresses at the door. But it was one of these mornings, while we were waiting, shivering in the corridor, that yet another page in the Bible leapt into life for me. He hung naked on the cross. I had not known, I had not thought. The paintings, the carved crucifixes showed at least a scrap of cloth. But this, I suddenly knew, was the respect and reverence of the artist. But oh, at the time itself, on that other Friday morning, there had been no reverence. No more than I saw in the faces around us now. I leaned toward Betsy ahead of me in line. Her shoulder blades stood out sharp and thin beneath her blue mottled skin. Betsy, they took his clothes too. Ahead of me, I heard a little gasp. Oh, Corrie. And I never thanked him. Every day the sun rose a little later. The bite took a little longer to leave the air. It will be better, everyone assured everyone else. When we move into permanent barracks, we'll have a blanket apiece, a bed of our own. Each of us painted into the picture her own greatest need. For me, it was a dispensary where Betsy could get medication for her cough. There will be a nurse assigned to the barracks. I said it so often that I convinced myself. I was doling out a drop of the Davidamon each morning on her piece of black bread. But how much longer could the small bottle last? Especially, I would tell her, if you keep sharing it around every time someone sneezes. The move to the permanent quarters came the second week in October. We were marched 10 abreast along a wide cinder avenue and then into a narrow street of barracks. Several times the column halted while numbers were read out. Names were never used at Ravensbrück. At last, Betsy's and mine were called. Prisoner 66729, prisoner 66730. We stepped out of line with a dozen or so others and stared at the long gray front of Barracks 28. Half its windows seemed to have been broken and replaced with rags. A door in the center led us into a large room where 200 or more women bent over knitting needles. On tables between them were piles of woolen socks in army gray. On either side, doors opened into two still larger rooms, by far the largest dormitories we have yet seen. Betsy and I followed a prisoner guide through the door at the right. Because of the broken windows, the vast room was in semi-twilight. Our noses told us first that the place was filthy. Somewhere, plumbing had backed up. The bedding was soiled and rancid. Then, as our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw that there were no individual beds at all, but great square piers stacked 3 high and wedged side by side and end to end, with only an occasional narrow aisle slicing through. We followed our guide single file. The aisle was not wide enough for two. Fighting back the claustrophobia of these platforms rising everywhere above us. The tremendous room was nearly empty of people. They must have been out on various work crews. At last, she pointed to a second tier in the center of a large block. To reach it, we had to stand on the bottom level, haul ourselves up, and then crawl across 3 other straw-covered platforms to reach the one that we would share with how many? The deck above us was too close to let us sit up. We lay back, struggling against the nausea that swept over us from the reeking straw. We could hear the women who had arrived with us finding their places. Suddenly, I sat up, striking my head on the crosslats above. Something had pinched my legs. "Fleas!" I cried. "Betsy, the place is swarming with them." We scrambled across the intervening platforms, heads low to avoid another bump, dropped down to the aisle, and edged our way to a patch of light. "Here, and here, another one!" I wailed. "Betsy, how can we live in such a place?" Show us how." It was said so matter-of-factly, it took me a second to realize she was praying. More and more, the distinction between prayer and the rest of life seemed to be vanishing for Betsy. "Corrie," she said, excited. "He's given us the answer. Before we asked, as he always does. In the Bible, this morning, where was it? Read that part again." I glanced down the long, dim aisle to make sure no guard was in sight, and then drew the Bible from its pouch. "It was in 1 Thessalonians," I said. "We were on our 3rd complete reading of the New Testament since leaving Scheveningen. And in the feeble light, I turned the pages. Here it is. Comfort the frightened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all." It seemed written expressly to Ravensbrook. "Go on," said Betsy. "That wasn't all." "Oh, yes. To one another and to all. Rejoice always, pray constantly, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus." That's it, Corrie. That's his answer. Give thanks in all circumstances. That's what we can do. We can start right now to thank God for every single thing about this new barracks.
I stared at her.
Yeah. You go. I have to pause. It is. It's lovely for her to remember her sister in this way. It really is. It's, a stalwart.
Yeah. I stared at her, then around me at the dark, foul-aired room. "Such as," I said, "such as being assigned here together." I bit my lip. "Oh, yes, Lord Jesus. Such as what you're holding in your hands." I looked down at the Bible. "Yes, thank you, dear Lord, for there was no inspection when we entered here. Thank you for all the women here in this room who will meet you in these pages." "Yes," said Betsy, "thank you for the very crowding here, since we're packed so close that many more will hear." She looked at me expectantly. "Corrie," she prodded. "Oh, all right. Thank you for the jammed, crammed, stuffed, packed, suffocating crowds." That came out very easily. "Thank you," Betsy went on
You wanted
serenely.
to punch someone in the face, didn't you?
Yes. "Thank you," Betsy went on serenely, "for the fleas and for the fleas." This was too much. "Betsy, there's no way even God can make me grateful for a flea." "Give thanks in all circumstances," she quoted. "It doesn't say in pleasant circumstances. Fleas are part of this place where God has put us." And so we stood between piers of bunks and gave thanks for fleas. But this time I was sure Betsy was wrong. Oh, Betsy. They started arriving soon after 6 o'clock, the women of Barracks 28, tired, sweat-stained, and dirty from the long forced labor details. The building, we learned from one of our platform mates, had been designed to hold 400. There were now 1,400 quartered here, with more arriving weekly as concentration camps in Poland, France, Belgium, Austria, as well as Holland were evacuated toward the center of Germany. There were 9 of us sharing our particular square, designed for 4, and some grumbling as the others discovered they would have to make room for Betsy and me. 8 acrid and overflowing toilets served the entire room. To reach them, we had to crawl not only over our own bedmates, but over those on the other platforms between us and the closest aisle, always at the risk of adding too much weight to the already sagging slats and crashing down on the people beneath. It happened several times that first night. From somewhere in the room would come a splintering sound, a shriek, smothered cries. Even when the slats held, the least movement on the upper platform sent a shower of dust and straw over the sleepers below, followed by a volley of curses. In Barracks 8, most of us had been Dutch. Here there was not even a common language, and among exhausted, ill-fed people, quarrels erupted constantly. There was one raging now as the women sleeping nearest the windows slammed them shut against the cold. At once, scores of voices demanded that they be raised again. Brawls were starting all up and down the side of the room. We heard scuffling, slaps, sobs. In the dark, I felt Betsy's hands clasp mine. Lord Jesus, she said aloud, send your peace into this room. There has been too little praying here. The very walls know it. But where you come, O Lord, the spirit of strife cannot exist. The change was gradual, but distinct. One by one, the angry sounds let up. I'll make you a deal, the voice spoke German with a strong Scandinavian accent. You can sleep in here where it's warmer, and I'll take your place by the window. And add your lice to my own? But there was a chuckle in the answer. No thanks. I'll tell you what, the third voice had a French burr. We'll open them halfway. That way we'll be only half frozen, and you'll only be half smothered. A ripple of laughter widened around the room at this. I lay back on the sour straw and knew there was one more circumstance for which I could give thanks. Betsy had come to Barracks 28. It's really sweet. Mm-hmm. Roll call came at 4:40 a.m. here, as it had in quarantine. A whistle roused us at...
That's funny. Yours says 4:40. This one says 4:30.
Oh.
She corrected it.
She realized she was 10 minutes off in a later edition.
10 extra minutes? How many times have you said that in the morning?
4:30 does sound worse than 4:40.
Sorry.
No, it's good. Neither the laugh. A whistle roused us at 4. Yep. When, without even shaking the straw from clothes and hair, the stampede began for the ration of bread and coffee in the center room. Last comers found none. The count was made in the Lagerstrasse, the wide avenue leading to the hospital. There we joined the occupants of other barracks, some 35,000 at that time, stretching out of sight in the pale glow of the street lamps, feet growing numb on the cold cinder ground. After roll call, work crews were called out. For weeks, Betsy and I were assigned to the Siemens factory. This huge complex of mills and railroad terminals was a mile and a half from the camp. The Siemens Brigade, several thousands of us, marched out the iron gate beneath the charged wires into a world of trees and grass and horizons. The sun rose as we skirted the little lake. The gold of the late fall fields lifted our hearts. The work at Siemens, however, was sheer misery. Betsy and I had to push a heavy handcart to a railroad siding where we unloaded large metal plates from a boxcar and wheeled them to the receiving gate of the factory. The grueling workday lasted 11 hours. At least, at noontime, we were given a boiled potato and some thin soup. Those who worked inside the camp had no midday meal. Returning to camp, we could barely lift our swollen and aching legs. The soldiers patrolling us bellowed and cursed, but we could only shuffle forward inches at a step. I noticed again how the local people turned their eyes another way. Back at the barracks, we formed yet another line. Would there never be an end to the columns and waits? To receive our ladle of turnip soup in the center room. Then, as quickly as we could for the press of people, Betsy and I made our way to the rear of the dormitory room where we held our worship service. Around our own platform area, there was not enough light to read the Bible. But back here, a small light bulb cast a wan yellow circle on the wall, and here an even larger group of women gathered. They were services like no others these times in Barracks 28. A single meeting night might include a recital of the Magnificat in Latin by a group of Roman Catholics, a whispered hymn by some Lutherans, and a sotto voce chant by Eastern Orthodox women. With each moment, the crowd around us would swell, packing the nearby platforms, hanging over the edges until the high structures groaned and swayed. At last, either Betsy or I would open the Bible, because only the Hollanders could understand the Dutch text we would translate aloud in German. And then we would hear the life-giving words passed back along the aisles in French, Polish, Russian, Czech, back into Dutch. They were little previews of heaven, these evenings beneath the light bulb. I would think of Harlem, each substantial church set behind its wrought iron fence and its barrier of doctrine. And I would know again that in darkness, God's truth shines most clear. So hopeful.
Mm-hmm. It is. It is. It's like I almost without the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
For the light has come into the darkness.
Yeah.
The darkness has not overcome it.
Like this beautiful reversal of Babylon,
Mm-hmm.
with the languages in a way. And
Yeah.
Redemption.
And in Germany's ruthlessness to, like, they're clinging to this darkness,
Mm-hmm.
just clinging to it, and it's actually falling apart even faster.
Right, yeah.
As they cling to it.
Oh man. First, Betsy and I called these meetings with great timidity. But as night after night went by and no guard ever came near us, we grew bolder. So many now wanted to join us that we held a second service after evening roll call. There in the Lagerstrasse, we were under rigid surveillance, guards in their warm wool capes marching constantly up and down. It was the same in the center room of the barracks, half a dozen guards or camp police always present. Yet in the large dormitory room, where there was almost no supervision at all, we did not understand it. Another strange thing was happening. The vitamin bottle was continuing to produce drops. It scarcely seemed possible, so small a bottle, so many doses a day. Now, in addition to Betsy, a dozen others on our pier were taking it. My instinct was always to hoard it. Betsy was growing so very weak. But the others were ill as well. It was hard to say no to eyes that burned with fever, hands that shook with chill. I tried to save it for the very weakest, but even these soon numbered 15, 20, 25. And still, every time I tilted the little bottle, a drop appeared at the tip of the glass stopper. It just couldn't be. I held it up to the light, trying to see how much was left, but the dark brown glass was too thick to see through. There was a woman in the Bible, Betsy said, whose oil jar was never empty. She turned to it in the book of Kings, the story of the poor widow of Zarephath who gave Elijah a room in her home. The jar of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of Jehovah which he spoke by Elijah. Well, but wonderful things happened all through the Bible. It was one thing to believe that such things were possible thousands of years ago, another to have it happen now, to us, this very day. And yet it happened this day, and the next, until an all little group of spectators stood around watching the drops fall into the daily rations of bread. Many nights I lay awake in the shower of straw dust from the mattress above, trying to fathom the marvelous supply lavished upon us. Maybe, I whispered to Betsy, only a molecule or two really gets through the little pinhole, and then in the air it expands. I heard her soft laughter in the dark. Don't try too hard to explain it, Corrie. Just accept it as a surprise from a father who loves you.
It's Abraham's laughter. Yeah. That hers is. No, stop thinking.
Yeah.
You're going to go mute, Corrie. Better be careful.
I know. And it gets better. I know it's coming. And then one day, Mean pushed her way to us in the evening food line. Look what I've got for you. Mien was a pretty young Dutch woman we had met in Voet. She was assigned to the hospital and often managed to bring to Barracks 28 some stolen treasure from the staff room. A sheet of newspaper to stuff in a broken window, a slice of bread left untouched on a nurse's plate. Now we peered into the small cloth sack she carried. "Vitamins," I cried, and then cast an apprehensive glance at the camp policeman nearby. "Yeast compound," I whispered. "Yes," she hissed back. There were several huge jars. I emptied each just the same amount. We gulped the thin turnip water, marveling at our sudden riches. Back at the bunk, I took the bottle from the straw. "We'll finish the drops first," I decided. But that night, no matter how long I held it upside down or how hard I shook it, not another drop appeared.
When will you learn, Corrie?
I know. So good. Think about we were talking about scarcity yesterday.
Yeah.
And just our fear, our
driving every one of our actions. Yeah. Think about this changing world and us as a nation thinking about scarcity. I mean, that's what makes us think it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
We're called to more. Yeah. And let love rule. Oh, Lenny Kravitz once said it. God said it first.
Yeah, he's got that copyrighted.
We're going to go over, huh?
Probably. You want to read? Pick up?
Sure.
All right.
On the 1st of November, a coat was issued to each prisoner. Betsy's and mine were both of Russian make, probably once trimmed with fur, thread shown where something had been torn from the collars and cuffs. Call-ups for the Siemens factory had ceased, and we speculated that it had been hit by one of the bombing raids that came within earshot almost nightly now. Betsy and I were put to work leveling some rough ground just inside the camp wall. This, too, was back-breaking labor. Sometimes, as I bent to lift a load, my heart cramped strangely. At night, spasms of pain gripped my legs. I was going to pause because, Siemens is still a company now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of strange to read that and think, I mean, they're in all kinds of things, but
right.
I don't know what their repercussions were coming out of the war.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we'd be surprised by some of the other companies that still exist and that
Mercedes-Benz and all those.
To capitalize off of the labor. Yeah.
But the biggest problem was Betsy's strength. One morning, after a hard night's rain, we arrived to find the ground sodden and heavy. Betsy had never been able to lift much. Today, her shovelfuls were microscopic, and she stumbled frequently as she walked to the low ground where we dumped the loads. "Schneller!" a guard screamed at her. "Can't you go faster?" Why must they scream? I wondered as I sank my shovel into the black muck. Why couldn't they speak like ordinary human beings? I straightened slowly, the sweat drying on my back. I was remembering where we had first heard this maniac sound. The Baye, in Tantian's rooms. A voice coming from the shell-shaped speaker. A scream lingering in the air even after Betsy had leapt to shut it off. "Loafer! Lazy swine!" The guard snatched Becky's shovel from her hands and ran from group to group of the digging crew, exhibiting the handful of dirt that was all Betsy had been able to lift. "Look what Madame Baroness is carrying. Surely she will overexert herself." The other guards and even some of the prisoners laughed. Encouraged, the guard threw herself into a parody of Betsy's faltering walk. A male guard was with our detail today, and in the presence of a man, the women guards were always animated. As the laughter grew, I felt a murderous anger rise. The guard was young and well-fed. Was it Betsy's fault that she was old and starving? But to my astonishment, Betsy, too, was laughing. "That's me, all right," she admitted. "But you better let me totter along with my little spoonful, or I'll have to stop altogether." The guard's plump cheeks went crimson. "I'll decide who's to stop." And snatching the leather crop from her belt, he slashed Betsy across the cheek and neck.
The chest.
This one says cheek, but yours says chest.
It says
Across
chest
the chest and
yeah.
neck.
Huh. Interesting.
Without knowing I was doing it, I had seized my shovel and rushed at her. Betsy stepped in front of me before anyone had seen. "Corrie," she pleaded, dragging my arm to my side. "Corrie, keep working." She tugged the shovel from my hand and dug it into the mud. Contemptuously, the guard tossed Betsy's shovel toward us. I picked it up, still in a daze. A red stain appeared on Betsy's collar. A welt began to swell on her neck. Betsy saw where I was looking and laid a bird-thin hand over the whip mark. "Don't look at it, Corrie. Look at Jesus only." She drew away her hand. It was sticky with blood. In mid-November, the rain started in earnest, chilly, drenching the day-long downpours that left beads of moisture even on the inside walls. The Lagerstrasse was never dry now, even when the rain let up. Deep puddles stood in the road. We were not allowed to step around them as the ranks were formed. Often we stood in the water up to our ankles, and at night the barracks reeked with rotting shoe leather. Betsy's cough began to bring up blood. We went to sick call at the hospital, but the thermometer registered only 102 degrees, not enough to admit her to the wards. Gracious. Alas for my fantasies of a nurse and a dispensary in each barracks. This large bare room in the hospital was where all the sick in the camp had to assemble, often standing outside in the rain for hours just to get through the door. I hated the dismal place full of sick and suffering women, but we had to go back again and again, for Betsy's condition was growing worse. She was not repelled by the room as I was. To her, it was simply a setting in which to talk about Jesus, as indeed was every place else. Wherever she was, at work, in the food line, in the dormitory, Betsy spoke to those around her about his nearness and his yearning to come into their lives. As her body grew weaker, her faith seemed to grow bolder. And sick call was such an important place, Corrie. Some of these people are at the very threshold of heaven. At last, one night, Betsy's fever registered over the required 104 degrees. There was another long wait until a nurse appeared to lead her and half a dozen others into the hospital proper. I stayed with them as far as the door to the ward, and then made my way slowly back to the barracks. As usual, as I stood in the door of the dormitory, it reminded me most of an anthill. Some women were already asleep after the long workday, but most were stirring about, some waiting for a turn at the toilets, others picking lice off themselves and their neighbors. I twisted and squirmed through the crowded aisles to the rear where the prayer service was just ending. Nights when Betsy and I reported to sick call, we left the Bible with Miss Wheelmaker, a saintly Roman Catholic woman from The Hague, who could render the Dutch words in German, French, Latin, or Greek. Women crowded around me, asking after Betsy. How was she? How long would she have to stay? Lights out blew and the scramble into the bunks began. I hoisted myself onto the middle tier and crawled across those already in place. What a difference since Betsy had come to this room. Where before this had been the moment for scuffles and cursing, tonight the huge dormitory buzzed with "Sorry, excuse me," and "No harm done." I found our section in the dark and squeezed into a spot in the middle. From the doorway, a searchlight swept the room, lingering on blocks where anything stirred. Someone's elbow dug into my back. Another woman's feet were 2 inches from my face. How was it possible, packed so close, to be so utterly and miserably alone? Chapter 14. The Blue Sweater. In the morning, a cold, wet mist hung over the Lagerstrasse. I was grateful that Betsy did not have to stand outside. All day, the blanketing fog hung over Ravensbrück, an eerie day when sound was muffled and the sun never rose. I was on potato detail, one of the crew hauling baskets of potatoes to long trenches to be covered with dirt against the freezing weather ahead. I was glad of the hard physical work that drove some of the damp from my bones for the occasional bite of raw potato when the guards were not watching. Next day, when the white pall still lay over the camp, my loneliness for Betsy became too much to bear. As soon as roll call was dismissed, I did a desperate thing. Mean had told me a way to get to the hospital without passing the guard post inside the door. The latrine at the rear, she said, had a very large window, too warped to close tight. Since no visiting was permitted in the hospital, relatives of patients often took this way of getting inside. In the dense fog, it was easy to get to the window unseen. I hoisted myself through it and then clapped my hand to my nose against the steaming odor. A row of lidless, doorless toilets stretched along one wall into the pool of their overflow. I dashed for the door and then stopped, my flesh crawling.
Mm.
Against this opposite wall, a dozen naked corpses lay side by side on their backs. Some of the eyes were open and seemed to stare unblinkingly at the ceiling. I was standing there lead-footed with horror when two men pushed through the door carrying a sheet-wrapped bundle between them. They did not even glance at me, and I realized they took me for a patient. I ducked round them into the hall and stood a moment, stomach nodding with the sight I had seen. After a while, I started aimlessly off to the left. The hospital was a maze of halls and doors. Already, I was not sure of the way back to the latrine. What if the potato crew left before I got back? And then a corridor looked familiar. I hurried, almost running from door to door. At last, the ward where I had left Betsy. No hospital personnel was in sight. I walked eagerly down the aisles of the cots, looking for face to face. Corrie! Betsy was sitting up in a cot near the window. Bless you.
Thank you.
She looked stronger, eyes bright, a touch of color in her sunken cheeks. No nurse or doctor had seen her yet, she said, but the chance to lie still and stay indoors had already made a difference. 3 days afterward, Betsy returned to Barracks 28. She still had received no examination or medicine of any kind, and her forehead felt feverish to my touch. But the joy of having her back outweighed my anxiety. Best of all, as a result of her hospitalization, she was given a permanent assignment to the knitting brigade.
Mm-hmm.
The women we had seen the very first day seated about the tables in the center room. This work was reserved for the weakest prisoners, and now overflowed into the dormitories as well. Those working in the sleeping rooms received far less supervision than those at the tables, and Betsy found herself with most of the day in which to minister to those around her. She was a lightning knitter who completed her quota of socks long before noon. She kept our Bible with her and spent hours each day reading aloud from it, moving from platform to platform. One evening, I got back to the barracks late from a wood gathering foray outside the walls. A light snow lay on the ground, and it was hard to find the sticks and twigs with which a small stove was kept going in each room. Betsy was waiting for me, as always, so that we could wait through the food line together. Her eyes were twinkling. "You're looking extraordinarily pleased with yourself," I told her. "You know, we've never understood why we had so much freedom in the big room," she said. "Well, I've found out." That afternoon, she said, there'd been a confusion in her knitting group about sock sizes, and they'd asked the supervisor to come and settle it. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't step through the door, and neither would the guards. And you know why? Betsy could not keep the triumph from her voice. "Because of the fleas!" That's what she said. "That place is crawling with fleas." My mind rushed back to our first hour in this place. I remembered Betsy's bowed head, remembered her thanks to God for creatures I could see no use for. Though Betsy was now spared heavy outdoor labor, she still had to stand the twice-daily roll call. As December temperatures fell, the roll calls became true endurance tests, and many did not survive. You pick up?
Sure. One dark morning, when ice was forming a halo around each street lamp, a feeble-minded girl 2 rows ahead of us suddenly soiled herself. A guard rushed at her, swinging her thick leather crop, while the girl shrieked in pain and terror. It was always more terrible when one of these innocent ones was beaten. Still, the officer Heron continued to whip her. It was the guard we had nicknamed the Snake because of the shiny dress she wore. I could see it now beneath the long wool cape, glittering in the light of the lamp as she raised her arm. I was grateful when the screaming girl at last lay still on the cinder street. Betsy, I whispered when the snake was far away. What can we do for these people? Afterward, I mean. Can't we make a home for them and care for them and love them? Corrie, I pray every day that we will be allowed to do this, to show them that love is greater. And it wasn't until I was gathering twigs later in the morning that I realized I had been thinking of the feeble-minded and Betsy of their persecutors. Persecutors. Several days later, my entire work crew was ordered to the hospital for medical inspection. I dropped my dress onto the pile just outside the door and joined the file of naked women. Ahead of us, to my surprise, a doctor was using the stethoscope with all the deliberateness of a real examination. What is this for? I whispered to the women ahead of me. Transport inspection, she hissed back, not moving her head. Munitions work. Transport? But they couldn't. They mustn't send me away. Dear God, don't let them take me away from Betsy. But to my terror, I passed one station after another. Heart, lungs, scalp, throat, and still I was in the line. Many were pulled out along the way, but those who remained looked hardly stronger. Swollen stomachs, hollow chests, spindly legs. How desperate for manpower Germany must be. I halted before a woman in a soiled white coat. She turned me around to face a chart on the wall, her hand cold on my bare shoulder. Read the lowest line if you can. I can't seem to read any of them. Lord forgive me. Just the top letter. That big E. The top letter was an F. The woman seemed to see me for the first time. You can see better than that. Do you want to be rejected? At Ravensbrück, munitions transport was considered a privilege. Food and living conditions in the factories were said to be far better than here in the camp. Oh, yes, doctor, my sister's here at Ravensbrück. She's not well. I can't leave her. The doctor sat down at her table and scrawled something on a piece of paper. Come back tomorrow to be fitted for glasses. Catching up to the line, I unfolded the small blue slip of paper. Prisoner 66730 was instructed to report for an optical fitting at 6:30 the following morning. 6:30 was the time the transport convoys were loaded. And so, as the huge vans rumbled down the Lagerstrasse the next day, I was standing in a corridor to the hospital waiting my turn at the eye clinic. The young man in charge was perhaps a qualified eye doctor, but his entire equipment consisted of a box of framed glasses, from gold-rimmed bifocals to a plastic-framed child's pair. I found none that fitted, and at last was ordered back to my work detail. But of course, I had no work assignment, having been marked down for transport. I walked back uncertainly toward Barracks 28. I slipped into the center room. The supervisor looked up over the heads of the knitting crew. Number? She said. I gave it, and she wrote it in a black-covered book. Pick up your yarn and a pattern sheet, she went on. You'll have to find a place on one of the beds. There's no room here. And she turned back to the pile of finished socks on the table. I stood blinking in the center of the room. Then grabbing a skein of the dark gray wool, I dashed through the dormitory door. And thus began the closest, most joyous weeks of all the time in Ravensbrück. Side by side, in the sanctuary of God's fleas, Betsy and I ministered the word of God to all in the room. We sat by deathbeds that became doorways of heaven. We watched women who had lost everything grow rich in hope. The knitters of Barracks 28 became the praying heart of the vast diseased body that was Ravensbrück, interceding for all in the camp, guards under Betsy's prodding as well as prisoners. We prayed beyond the concrete walls for the healing of Germany, of Europe, of the world, as Mama had once done from the prison of a crippled body. And as we prayed, God spoke to us about the world after the war. It was extraordinary. In this place, where whistles and loudspeakers took the place of decisions, God asked us what we were going to do in the years ahead. Betsy was always very clear about the answer for her and me. We were to have a house, a large one, much larger than the Baye, to which people who had been damaged by concentration camp life would come until they felt ready to live back again in the normal world. It's such a beautiful house, Corrie. The floors are all inlaid wood, with statues set in the walls and a broad staircase sweeping down, and gardens all around it where they can plant flowers. Will do them such good, Corrie, to care for flowers. I would stare at Betsy in amazement as she talked about these things. She spoke always as though she were describing things that she saw, as if that wide, winding staircase and those bright gardens were the reality, this cramped and filthy barracks, the dream. It makes me think a little bit of Revelation and how we tend to think, well, we're living in reality and the new heaven, the new earth is this fantastical place that's like the thing we dream of, and that that is the real we will know ever. And this is, the C.S. Lewis would call it, like, this is the shadow lands.
Yeah.
We won't, like what we think is real now is just but
a shadow.
But it wasn't a dream. It was really, achingly, endlessly true. And it was always during roll calls that the accumulated misery threatened to overwhelm me. One morning, 3 women from Barracks 28 lingered inside a few minutes to avoid the cold. All the following week, the entire barracks was punished by the extra hour at attention. The lights on the Lagerstrasse were not even lit when we were driven from our bunks at 3:30 a.m. It was during this pre-inspection lineup one morning that I saw what I had till then refused to believe. Headlights appeared at the far end of the long street, wavering over the snow. Trucks with open flatbeds in the rear were approaching, splattering slush as they passed. They pulled up at the front door of the hospital. The door opened and a nurse appeared, supporting an old woman whose legs buckled as she limped down the steps. The nurse lifted her gently onto the back of the truck. They were pouring out of the door now, leaning on the arms of nurses and hospital helpers, the old, the ill. Last of all came orderlies with stretchers between them. Our eyes took in every detail of the scene. Our brains were fused. We had known, of course, that when overcrowding reached a certain point, the sickest were taken to the brick building at the foot of the great square smokestack. But that these women here in front of us, these very ones, it was not possible. Above all, I could not put it together with the kindly behavior of the nurses. That one in the truck just ahead, bending solicitously, even tenderly, over her patient. What was passing through her mind just now? And all the while it grew colder. One night during evening roll call, a platoon somewhere far down the Lagerstrasse began a rhythmic stamping. The sound grew as others picked it up. The guards did not stop us, and at last the entire street was marching in place, pounding tattered shoes against the frozen ground, driving circulation back into numb feet and legs. From now on, this is the sound of roll call, the stamping of thousands of feet on the long, dark street. And as the cold increased, so did the special temptation of concentration camp life. The temptation to think only of oneself. It took 1,000 cunning forms. I quickly discovered that when I maneuvered our way toward the middle of the roll call formation, we had a little protection from the wind. I knew that this was self-centered. When Betsy and I stood in the center, someone else had to stand on the edge. How easy it was to give it other names. I was acting only for Betsy's sake. We were in an important ministry and must keep well. It was colder in Poland than in Holland. These Polish women probably were not feeling the chill the way we were. Selfishness had a life of its own. As I watched Mean's bag of yeast compound disappear, I began taking it from beneath a straw only after lights out, when others would not see, and ask for some. Wasn't Betsy's health more important? You see, God, she can do so much for them. Remember that house after the war? And even if it wasn't right, it wasn't so very wrong, was it? Not wrong like sadism and murder and the other monstrous evils we saw in Ravensbrück every day. Oh, this was the great ploy of Satan in that kingdom of his, to display such blatant evil that one could almost believe one's own secret sins didn't matter. The cancer spread. The second week in December, every occupant of Barracks 28 was issued an extra blanket. The next day, a large group of evacuees arrived from Czechoslovakia. One of them assigned to our platform had no blanket at all, and Betsy insisted that we give her one of ours. So that evening, I lent her a blanket, but I didn't give it to her. In my heart, I held onto the right to that blanket. Was it coincidence that joy and power imperceptibly drained from my ministry? My prayers took on a mechanical ring. Even Bible reading was dull and lifeless. Betsy tried to take over for me, but her cough made reading aloud impossible. And so I struggled on with worship and teaching that has ceased to be real, until one drizzly, raw afternoon when just enough light came through the window to read by. I came to Paul's account of his thorn in the flesh. 3 times, he said, he'd begged God to take away his weakness, whatever it was. And each time God had said, "Rely on me." At last, Paul concluded. The words seemed to leap from the page. His very weakness was something to give thanks for. Because now Paul knew that none of the wonders and miracles which followed his ministry could be due to his own virtues. It was all Christ's strength, never Paul's. And there it was. The truth blazed like sunlight in the shadows of Barracks 28. The real sin I had been committing was not that of inching toward the center of a platoon because I was cold. The real sin lay in thinking that any power to help and transform came from me. Of course, it was not my wholeness, but Christ that made the difference. The short winter day was fading. I could no longer separate the words in the page. And so I closed the Bible, and to that group of women clustering close, I told the truth about myself. My self-centeredness, my stinginess, my lack of love. That night, real joy returned to my worship. You knew they'd be reading about Paul.
You can't help but do.
You want to go?
Sure. The short winter day was fading. I could no longer separate the words on the page. I guess I'll repeat that. Each roll call, the wind seemed sharper. Whenever she could, Mean smuggled newspapers from the staff room at the hospital, which we placed inside our clothes. Nolly's blue sweater beneath Betsy's dress was black with newsprint. The cold seemed to be affecting Betsy's legs. Sometimes in the morning she could not move them at all, and 2 of us would have to carry her between us. It was not hard. She weighed no more than a child. But she could no longer stamp her feet as the rest of us did to keep the blood flowing. When we returned to the dormitory, I would rub her feet and hands, but my own only picked up the chill from hers. It was the week before Christmas that Betsy woke up, unable to move either legs or arms. I shoved my way through the crowd aisles to the center room. The snake was on duty. "Please," I begged, "Betsy is ill. Oh, please. She's got to get to the hospital. Stand at attention. State your number." "Prisoner 66730 reporting. Please, my sister is sick." "All prisoners must report for the count. If she's sick, she can register at sick call." Mary de Graaf, a Dutch woman on the tier above ours, helped me form a cradle with our arms and carry Betsy outside. The rhythmic stamping had already begun in the Lagerstrasse. We carried her to the hospital, then stopped. In the light of the street lamps, the sick call line stretched to the edge of the building and out of sight around the corner. In the sooty snow alongside, 3 bodies lay where they had fallen. Without a word, Marique and I turned and carried our load back to the Lagerstrasse. After roll call, we got her back into bed. Her speech was slow and blurred, but she was trying to say something. "A camp, Corrie. Concentration camp. But we're in charge." I had to bend very close to hear. The camp was in Germany. It was no longer a prison, but a home where people who had been warped by this philosophy of hate and force could come to learn another way. There were no walls, no barbed wire, and barracks had window boxes. It will be so good for them, watching things grow. People can learn to love from flowers.
Mhm.
I knew by now which people she meant. The German people. I thought of the snake standing in the barracks door that morning. State your number. All prisoners must report for the count. I looked into Betsy's shrunken face. We are to have this camp in Germany instead, Betsy. Instead of the big house in Holland. Oh no!
Mhm.
She seemed shocked. You know, we have the house first. It's ready and waiting for us. Such tall, tall windows. The sun is streaming in. Coughing fit seized her when finally she lay still. The stain of blood blackened the straw. She dozed fitfully during the day and night that followed, waking several times with the excitement of some new detail about our work in Holland or Germany. The barracks are gray, Corrie, but we'll paint them green, bright, light green, like springtime. We'll be together, Betsy. We're doing all this together? You're sure about that? Always together, Corrie. You and I, always together. When the siren blew next morning, Marique and I again carried Betsy from the dormitory. The snake was standing at the street door. As we started through with our fragile burden, she stepped in front of us. Take her back to the bunks.
Mhm.
I thought Take her back. Wonderingly, we replaced Betsy on the bed. Sleet rattled against the windows. Was it possible that the atmosphere of Barracks 28 had affected even this cruel guard? As soon as roll call was dismissed, I ran back to the dormitory. There beside our bed stood the snake. Beside her, 2 orderlies from the hospital were setting down a stretcher. The snake straightened almost guiltily as I approached. Prisoners ready for transfer, she snapped. I looked at the woman more closely. She had risked fleas and lice to spare Betsy the sick call line. She did not stop me as I started after the stretcher. Our group of knitters was just entering the big room. As we passed, a Polish friend dropped to her knees and made the sign of the cross. Sleet stung us as we reached outside. I stepped close to the stretcher to form a shield for Betsy. We walked past the waiting line of sick people, through the door, and into a large ward. They placed the stretcher on the floor, and I leaned down to make out Betsy's words. Must tell people what we have learned here. We must tell them that there is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still. They will listen to us, Corrie, because we have been here. I stared at her wasted form. But when will all this happen, Betsy? Now, right away. Oh, very soon. By the first of the year, Corrie, we'll be out of prison. A nurse had caught sight of me. I backed to the door of the room and watched as they placed Betsy on a narrow cot close to the window. I ran around to the outside of the building, and at last Betsy caught sight of me. We exchanged smiles and soundless words until one of the camp police shouted at me to move along. About noontime, I put down my knitting and went out to the center room. Prisoner 66730 reporting. Request permission to visit the hospital. I stood ramrod straight. The snake glanced up and then scrawled out a pass. Outside, it was still sleeting. I reached the door of the ward, but the horrible nurse would not let me enter, even with my pass. So I went again to the window next to Betsy's cot. I waited until the nurse left the room and then tapped gently. Betsy's eyes opened. Slowly, she turned her head. Are you all right? I formed with my lips. She nodded. You must get good rest, I went on. She moved her lips in reply, but I could not follow. She formed the words again. I bent my head to one side, level with hers. The blue lips opened again. So much work to do. The snake was off duty during the afternoon and evening, and though I asked other guards repeatedly, I did not again get permission to leave. The minute roll call was dismissed the following morning, I headed for the hospital, permission or no. I reached the window and cupped my eyes to peer in. A nurse was standing directly between me and Betsy. I ducked out of sight, waited a minute, and then looked again. A second nurse had joined the first, both now standing where I wanted to see. They stepped to the head and foot of the bed. I gazed curiously at what lay on it. It was a carving in old yellow ivory. There was no clothing on the figure. I could see each ivory rib and the outline of the teeth through the parchment cheeks. It took me a moment to realize it was Betsy. The nurses had each seized 2 corners of the sheet, and they lifted it between them and carried the bundle from the room before my heart had started to beat again in my chest. Betsy, but she had too much to do. She could not. Where were they taking her? Where had they gone? I turned from the window and began running along the side of the building, chest hurting me as I breathed. Then I remembered the washroom, that window at the rear. That was where. My feet carried me mechanically around to the back of the building, and there with my hand on the windowsill, I stopped. Suppose she was there. Suppose they had laid Betsy on the floor. I started walking again. I walked for a long time, still with that pain in my chest, and each time my feet took me back to the washroom window. I would not go in. I would not look. Betsy could not be there. I walked some more. Strangely enough, although I passed several camp police, no one stopped or questioned me. Corrie! I turned around to see Mien running after me. Corrie, I've looked for you everywhere. Oh, Corrie, come! She seized my arm and drew me toward the back of the hospital. When I saw where she was headed, I wrenched my arm free. I know, Mien, I know already. She didn't seem to hear. She seized me again and led me to the washroom window, pushed me in ahead of her. In the reeking room stood a nurse. I drew back in alarm, but Mien was behind me. This is the sister, Mien said to the nurse. I turned my head to the side. I would not look at the bodies that lined the far wall. Mien put an arm around my shoulder and drew me across the room till we were standing above that heartbreaking row. Corrie, do you see her? I raised my eyes to Betsy's face. Lord Jesus, what have you done? Oh Lord, what are you saying? What are you giving me? For there lay Betsy, her eyes closed as if in sleep, her face full and young. The care lines, the grief lines, the deep hollows of hunger and disease were simply gone. In front of me was the Betsy of Harlem, happy and at peace, stronger, freer. This was the Betsy of heaven, bursting with joy and health. Even her hair was graciously in place as if an angel had ministered to her. At last I turned wonderingly to Mien. The nurse went silently to the door and opened it for us herself. You can leave through the hall, she said softly. I looked once more at the radiant face of my sister. Then Mien and I left the room together. A pile of clothes was heaped outside in the hallway. On top lay Nolly's blue sweater. I stopped to pick it up. The sweater was threadbare and stained with newsprint, but it was a tangible link with Betsy. Mien seized my arm. Don't touch those things. Black lice. They'll all be burned. So I left behind the last physical tie. It was just as well. It was better. Now what tied me to Betsy was the hope of heaven. Man, oh man. Well, I think we may have made a record of tonight, going longer, but that's something.
Yeah,
I think the tears come because Betsy's praying of the real hope. She sees the real hope of the Father. She has nothing, but she has everything.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful picture.
I think she's joined Father also.
Yeah, that's right.
It's good.
On his lap. Yeah. One more chapter, y'all. So
yes, one more week. See you next Monday.
there is a Zoom meeting tomorrow. I don't have the link, but reach out to Jen and try and get that. And we'll try and get that link too. and join if we can. So,
Somebody, do we
um,
have a note from somebody before we get off?
yeah, Mary and Martha. Yeah. So true. So true. So
great.
much of it is so parallel. It's like these stories over again, the story of the endless oil. Yeah, it's the Father's faithfulness to us all. So thank you for joining us and
Thank you.
helping us remind
Yeah.
each other of that.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. That's good. Peace to you.
good night.